Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. We're looking at excretory system part 2. Basically, what we're looking at right now is what the nephron is and how urine is formed. Okay, so let's move on to the actual anatomy of the kidney and look at it a little bit finer. We're going to change that pen right away because I know some of you guys won't like it. Let's go pink. So we have 3 different sections, and we'll look at what it looks like in a second here. We have the renal cortex, the renal medulla, and the renal pelvis. As you guys can remember from the circulatory system, renal means kidney. And what we need to think about is that there's a big part here called a nephron. And the nephron is the functioning, filtering part of the kidney. And then for each of these nephrons, for each of the kidneys, there's over 1 million of these nephrons. So there's a lot of things that are doing the filtering. So let's look at what a kidney looks like in terms of a long section. So here's your kidney. You can see, as we saw before, we have a renal artery entering, bringing blood to the kidney, and we have the renal vein bringing it away. We have 3 different divisions, like I was just saying before. If you're looking in a long section here, which is right here, the very top here is called the renal cortex, the middle is called the renal medulla, and the inner part here, as you can see this part here, is called the renal pelvis. The renal pelvis is where the renal artery and vein are entering. Okay. The renal cortex is where the majority of the filtering is going to take place, but some of it happens in the medulla, as we're going to see in a few minutes here. So we're going to zoom back and forth to this picture, but what this is the anatomy of a nephron. So this is the functional unit that's going to be filtering the blood. So as you can see, we have our renal artery, and it's going to branch out into something called an afferent arteriole. So it's a smaller, more simplified artery. It's going to enter this thing called a glomerulus, which we'll look at later, and then the blood comes back out, still part of the artery. It's called the efferent artery. So let's look at a closer look-see at the nephron. So first of all, in terms of its anatomy, it's composed of a system of tubules. Each nephron has its own blood supply. As you can see, the afferent arterioles are taking it directly to and from that nephron. And like we just said here, it goes to the renal artery, into an afferent arteriole, to the glomerulus, and then it leaves the glomerulus and then leaves by way of the efferent arteriole. In case you're wanting to remember which one comes first, A comes before E, so the afferent starts, efferent exits. And then that efferent arteriole takes it to a peritubular capillaries, which doesn't mean anything to you yet. And these are the capillaries that surround the rest of the nephrons for more filtering, which we'll see. And then it ends up going out through the renal vein, which will take it back to the inferior vena cava and out back to the heart. So you might want to pause it. I'm going nice and slow for you before we move on. So continuing on here, so what is the glomerular capsule? We also call it the Bowman's capsule because seriously, who can say glomerular? It's a cup-like structure. So it looks something like this. And what it has is these things called podocytes. It's pretty much little holes in the glomerulus, which allows things to go through it. Okay, so they're little pores. And what happens next is it goes through something called the proximal convoluted tubule, or we call it the PCT. And these contain little microvilli. Remember what the villus in the small intestine were for? These little bumpy things, the reason why they were there and the structure they had was for maximal surface area, for maximal absorption, same thing. And like I just said, oops. Moving along, the next part is what we call the loop of Henle. So the loop of Henle is the descending part and ascending part. So what this looks so far, we had our glomerulus, we had our convoluted tubule, and then it descends into a loop and then ascends back up. And certain things are going to be happening here, but we'll get into in a minute. So it's a U-shaped tube, obviously based on the structure. And then what it comes back up to is the convoluted tubule, which is the exiting part of the loop of Henle. These ones don't have the microvilli like the proximal convoluted tubule do, which would indicate that there's not as much absorption going on there. And so the reason why is it's meant for stuff exiting rather than being able to be reabsorbed. And then the last thing here is the collecting duct. This is the last part where urine is collected. Okay, so that was the structure, or I guess mostly the pathway. Now let's talk about what happens at each step. So here is what we're looking at. This is the anatomy of the nephron. Here's the glomerulus, or the Bowman capsule. As you can see, there's a big network of capillaries here. It enters through these tubules. Certain things get in. This is the proximal convoluted tubule. Here's the descending limb of Henle. Here's the ascending, and here's the distal convoluted tubule before it comes into the collecting duct. So this is the urine formation. So this is how the urine is actually created in our kidneys. First of all, we have the one that we were talking about just a second ago called glomerular filtration. We also call this pressure filtration. A lot of people had a question about what happens when you have low blood pressure. This is the mechanism that it's going to affect. So what happens, it's in the Bowman capsule in the glomerulus. And what's going on is blood's entering through this afferent arteriole, and it's pressurized. So what it does is it forces water and small molecules into the glomerular capsule, and it filters it, and it causes it to go into the nephron. Anything that can't be filtered through those podocytes will be brought back out through the efferent arteriole and brought back into the blood system, so it doesn't go through the kidneys. Okay, so anything that's processed must be reabsorbed, or it'll be brought out of our system as waste. So if anything accidentally gets into the kidneys that we still want, there's still a chance for it to be reabsorbed back into the blood. And then the last thing is that the filtered fluid that comes into the kidneys, into the nephron, is called filtrate. So keeping on going on, the next thing that happens in this kidney, in the nephron, is tubular reabsorption. This happens in the proximate convoluted tubule and also a little bit in the loop of Henle. So what's happening here, molecules are being reabsorbed. So these are things that actually came through the podocytes that we didn't really want to. They just came through based on its size. So it can be actively and passively transported out. So actively means energy, passively means no energy used. So things like sodium. Sodium needs energy in order to get out. Chlorine can follow passively with no energy. Water goes through by osmosis, so no energy. And there's also glucose, which I'm not sure if I'm going to talk about in a second, needs energy in order to get out. So only molecules recognized by carrier proteins can be actively reabsorbed. Oh, there it is, glucose. So it needs that carrier protein in order to get out. Specific to only glucose. Nothing else can use that carrier protein. And there's also a limit in the carrier protein. So for someone who has a lot of glucose and they're not actively taking it into their livers as glycogen, that's evidence that someone might have diabetes because they're continuing to pee out way too much glucose. So that's a test. There's a urine strip where you can pee on glucose to test if your glucose level is too high, and it might be a symptom of diabetes. Tubular secretion is the last one. So what's happening here, this is in the last part of your nephron, the distal convoluted tubule. So things like this are going to be brought back into the tubule from the blood. So hydrogen ions. So if you want to lower the pH, or I guess raise the pH of your blood, potassium, creatinine, and any other drugs like penicillin will be brought back into the tubules because we want to get rid of those. And they're actively transported from the blood, so need energy. Oops. So the last thing is what urine actually contains. So this collecting tubule, this is the last thing where we're concentrating the urine, last things that we need to be brought back in. So anything that has not been blocked from entering the nephron, anything that has not been reabsorbed, backed out, will be taken out of the urine. So things like this: water, salts, urea, uric acid, ammonium, creatinine, and any other drugs.